Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And I freely admit there are times when I do judge a book, show, or a movie by its proverbial cover. I know that's something we're all taught not to do, and most reasonable people make a concerted effort to avoid that kind of prejudice. But every now and then, we're guilty of rushing to judgment on something. And that's a shame too, because it ensures we'll miss out on something that might end up being much better than we thought. That's exactly why I was so thankful that I gave My Adventures with Superman a chance. This show that debuted on Adult Swim was something that I was not eager to check out. In fact, when it was first announced, I rolled my eyes at the character design, the premise, and the fact that it was on Adult Swim. Now, in my defense, some of that was because I grew up on the '90s Superman cartoon produced by Bruce Timm. That show set an incredibly high bar for any Superman show. And since then, few efforts have even come close, aside from a few standalone animated movies. On the surface, My Adventures with Superman looked nothing like that show. If anything, those making this show were going out of their way to give this show a more distinct aesthetic from every '90s and early 2000s iteration. Sure, Superman still has his iconic look, right down to the red cape and underwear. But everyone else from Lois Lane to Perry White to Jimmy Olsen to Lex Luthor, they all looked and carried themselves very differently. I certainly get the intention. A new Superman show has to do something to set itself apart from its predecessors. Otherwise, it'll just come off as a ripoff or a gimmick. But nothing about the distinctions in My Adventures with Superman seemed compelling to me. So for the first season of the show, I ignored it. Even when the show started getting some surprisingly good word of mouth, I did not give it a chance, and I didn't intend to. Then, a few months after the first season ended, I was feeling really restless on one particular afternoon. Wasn't in the mood for a movie. I was also in between shows on my watch list. So I found myself browsing Max for some DC Comics content. Usually, I'd pick out an old episode of Batman or Justice League. But on this particular day, I just wasn't in the mood for reruns. So, on a whim, I decided to just put on the first episode of My Adventures with Superman. I admit I had low expectations. I fully expected to just let it play out before going back to my favorite Justice League episodes. But, much to my surprise, I found myself enjoying it. Then I watched 2 more episodes, and I enjoyed them just as much. Still wasn't totally hooked, but it did find plenty of appeal. Yes, it was very different from previous Superman shows, but those differences quickly stood out in a positive way. One of the first things I grew to like about this show is just how dorky and lovable Clark Kent is. He doesn't carry himself with the confidence and poise of an iconic hero. He's just a young man trying to start a new life in Metropolis, and fumbling hilariously along the way because he's so out of his element. But it never comes off as annoying, intentional, or over the top. The way Clark talks, the way he carries himself, and the way he interacts with others, it just feels so lovably human. He's still very much an outsider, both as an alien and as a small-town guy moving to the big city. Initially, he has no desire to use his immense abilities to become a full-time superhero. He just wants to help people, which is perfectly in line with Superman's Boy Scout nature. But he quickly finds himself caught up in these big, dangerous situations. He doesn't seek them out, doesn't attract them in any way. All this stuff was going to happen in Metropolis with or without Superman's presence. But once he's involved, he does what we all expect Superman to do: help people and save the day. That alone makes clear that the makers of this show really understand Superman as a character. There's no effort to needlessly scrutinize his unique approach to heroism. They just build a conflicted, chaotic world around him, then they let Superman be Superman. But those qualities are all just the basics, and plenty of other superhero shows get them right. What really makes My Adventures with Superman work, in my mind, is how it handles the non-superhero elements of the story. And this is where Lois Lane enters the picture. Now, I want to go on record as saying that ever since the Dana Delaney version of Lois we got in the '90s cartoon, I have not cared for most other versions of Lois. I'm of the opinion that since the early 2000s, most takes on Lois Lane have either been forgettable, bland, or just plain awful. I feel like they gave Lois too much of an attitude in Smallville. I'm also of the opinion that the Amy's Adam version in Man of Steel was nothing more than an empty plot device to get Superman to be Superman. And for many years in the comics, Lois was always just sort of there, functioning only as Superman's wife and or love interest. She rarely did anything that stood out other than be a reporter and a regular damsel in distress. But the Lois Lane we get in My Adventures with Superman? You can say a lot about her, but you can't say she lacks for personality. She has an energy and drive to her that we have not seen in many versions of Lois. She also has a bubbly, outgoing personality that really stands out in a crowd, even when she's not around Superman. This Lois Lane is not the kind of person who just talks about seeking the truth. She's a woman of action. She eagerly and willingly throws herself into a story, even when she doesn't know Superman will be there to save her. And yet, when she's around Clark Kent or Superman, she quickly melts into this awkward, blushing, love-struck young woman. And throughout the first season, Clark acts the same way. It's so unsubtle and simple. There's no effort to make this elaborate romantic subplot that explains why she and Superman fall in love. Because ultimately, that's not necessary. This is Superman and Lois Lane, for crying out loud. One of the most recognizable superhero couples of the past century. You don't need to complicate their romance. Just let them be awkward, mushy, and flirty around one another. And from there, the romance blossoms naturally. The show just makes an effort to balance it out with solid character moments and supporting plots. And on that front, My Adventures with Superman succeeds every bit as much. Getting Lois and Superman right definitely helped, but the world building that occurs around them is what really got me hooked on this show. Because it does not follow the same plots we've seen before. It also builds very different versions of well-known supporting characters. When Clark first arrives in Metropolis, he doesn't know much about where he came from or his birth parents. He just knows that he's an alien and he has all these amazing powers. And finding the truth, that ends up being a surprisingly dramatic process. At first, he thinks he was sent to Earth to conquer it, and that troubles Clark a great deal. Because if that's his purpose, he wants no part of it. It leads to a lot of self-doubt, something we normally don't get from Superman. But what gets him through it isn't his power, or even his innate goodness. It's his friends and family. Once he and Lois start getting close, once he and Jimmy Olsen develop a friendship, Clark really comes to embrace his identity as Superman. He was always inclined to do the right thing simply because it's the right thing. He just needed other influences to become that iconic hero that we know and love. At the same time, he also needed his share of enemies to complement those influences. But My Adventures with Superman takes a very different approach to developing those enemies. It would have been easy to just throw Lex Luthor into the mix. He has always been the personification of everything Superman stands against. But this show ended up opting for a more challenging approach. Yes, Lex Luthor does eventually show up, but his role is relatively minor into the latter parts of Season 2. For much of the first and second seasons of the show, Superman's biggest enemy isn't one particular villain. It's this overall sentiment of xenophobia that's leveled at him once he shows up. And that works perfectly within the context of Superman's story. Because he is an alien. He is a refugee. He might not have been born on Earth, but he still considers it his home. And even though he isn't human, he still embodies the best of all humanity. Despite this, there are those who still fear him. It's not just that he's immensely powerful, it's that he's an outsider, an intruder, a harbinger of a possible alien invasion. These are all real fears expressed by the likes of Amanda Waller, media outlets, and General Sam Lane. Now, you don't need to be well-versed in modern politics to see some of the parallels here. The mere idea that Superman is an alien gives certain people all the excuse they need to hate, fear, and oppose his very presence. It doesn't matter to them how much good he does, or how many times he proves that he just wants to help. He's an alien, so they can't trust him. Again, the political undertones here aren't subtle. I would even argue that they're much more overt than we've seen in other Superman media. But My Adventures with Superman doesn't use this concept to deconstruct or undermine Superman's heroism. Instead, it's primarily used as a catalyst. It helps further reinforce that Superman is the embodiment of an ideal. Even when there are those who refuse to accept that any man of such power can be good, it doesn't stop Superman from being that good. Season 1 gives him numerous challenges from humanity. Everyone seems so eager to question his intentions or overthink his agenda. And Season 2 gives him a far bigger challenge from his former homeworld. The arrival of Brainiac, his cousin Kara, and recordings from his birth parents, they all push Superman into being more alien than human. But none ultimately succeed. In the end, Superman still loves, cherishes, and protects humanity. He still sees Earth as his adopted home. And he will continue protecting it and its people, regardless of how many see him as a potential threat. Along the way, he falls in love with Lois Lane. He becomes best friends with Jimmy Olsen. He even manages to cultivate the love and adoration of many throughout Metropolis, including a few who were once enemies. How he gets to this point might be different from what we've seen in other shows, movies, or comics. But My Adventures with Superman finds a way to make it work while giving us an entirely new reason to appreciate Superman's legacy. All of this came from a show that I had written off from the moment it was announced. And were it not for that one fateful afternoon, I never would have discovered this remarkable take on such an iconic character. Now, there's a lot more I could say about My Adventures with Superman, but I'll save that for other videos. And with Season 3 already in development, I suspect this show will give me plenty more to talk about down the line. In the meantime, I would encourage everyone who judged this show like I did to give it a chance. Even if you don't like the animation style or the character designs, just check out the first few episodes of My Adventures with Superman. See what this show has to offer. Even if it's a very different kind of Superman story from what you're used to, it's still a Superman story, and a damn good one at that. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, take care and stay safe.